Hey Grandmasters, welcome to the Week 3 update. I'm going to show you a game played by Vassily Ivanchuck. Yeah, that's the gentleman who missed Maiden 1 in that video I posted before this. Ivanchuck is a tremendous chess player, and I'm using one of his rapid games, meaning the time control was probably 30 or 40 minutes for the entire game. And I like to show grandmasters playing this time control sometimes because they really display so much common sense, and they just play really solid moves sometimes because they don't have forever to think. So every now and then you catch one of these quick games where the grandmaster's moves just seem so very clear. And I thought all of us would get a lot out of seeing this game. So it begins as a Scotch game, e4, e5, and Ivanchuck is playing the black pieces, knight f3, knight c6, and after d4, we have what's known as the Scotch game. So white is immediately breaking in the center, trying to eliminate black's center pawn, which he does. So Ivanchuck, with black, takes the pawn, and white has some choices here. Some players will play bishop to c4. That's known as the Scotch gambit, kind of giving away a pawn in return for getting fast development. But white just plays the main line and takes with the knight. Now, this is not an opening video. There are other choices here for white and black, but white plays one of the older lines, which is just bishop c5. I mean, bring out a piece and attack something. One way for white to play is to protect that piece, and then black could keep piling on the pressure, pawn to c3. You see how they're fighting for that d4 square, and knight can come to e7, and you have a chess game to play, correct? After the move bishop c5, however, white does not have to protect the knight. Instead, you can trade it off and take on c6. And if you know a little bit about this opening, and hopefully some of you with black who've never seen the Scotch game, now you have something you might be able to play, you don't have to take the knight. Not yet. You have this really nice in-between move that you can play. So I recommend you pause the video and see if you can guess what black did. Okay, they played the move queen f6, which threatens mate down here on f2. So after queen f6, white obviously cannot save their knight. They played queen f3 just to kind of, confront the queen, protect the mate, see if the queens come off. And Ivanchuck decides to take the knight with his b pawn. And we've talked a lot about taking away from the center in the opening, but taking with the b pawn is just fine in this position. Knight to c3, and now the queens come off the board, forcing the g pawn to take. And I thought this was kind of a cool pawn structure because if you look at it carefully, both sides have 3 pawn islands. They each have an isolated pawn, but those isolated pawns are on opposite sides of the board. Then there's a space. Then there's a clump of pawns here. You see this pawn island for white, for black? Then there's another space, and then 3 healthy pawns. Well, look at it from white side. Let me flip the board for you. Same deal. Here's your isolated pawn. You have a space, kind of this clump of 3 pawns, another space, and 3 healthy pawns. So the pawn structure, while you have 3 islands each, those pawns are on different squares or different spots, giving each player a chance to play the game differently. I mean, if everything was symmetrical and we each had 2 bishops and a knight, blah, 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 it might not be as fun to play. So Ivanchuck, d6. Simple chess, right? Why did he play d6? You can answer that question. Very good, James. He played d6 to develop his light-squared bishop. And notice because his d pawn is still on the d file, he's got control of the e5 square too. All right, white to play. Who says you have to bring out the knights and bishops first? How about rook g1? Yeah, well, talk to yourself. If you're moving a rook before a minor piece, what's your reason? Well, the reason is you're attacking an undefended pawn. If you think you can get away with it, by all means do it. Now, what do we do as black? We probably don't want to give the pawn away. So how do you think Ivanchuck solved the problem? Couple of ways. You might think about putting your bishop on d4 to protect that pawn. He's like, nah, I'll just move the g6 pawn, and that keeps the rook out of the game. Bishop e3. Well, you have a decision to make. You can back the bishop up or take on e3. Kind of works both ways. It looks fine. He decides to make the trade to save a little bit of time, knowing that white has to take back, and now he breaks the pawn structure with f5. Very simple move. He's playing the move, trying to get white to take on f5 so he can develop his bishop in one move. White is not interested and castles, and black simply develops another piece. And at this point, there's a lot of pressure on the e4 square that white decides to take. Don't take with your g-pawn. You could, but if you take with your g-pawn, you're just going to invite the rook here. You guys can see that, right? No reason to let that rook into your territory. So he takes with the bishop, keeping everything solid. The bishop gets kicked. Okay, you're playing a 2400. That's the opponent that you're playing. The player with the white pieces is rated 2400. He just attacked your bishop, Maury. What are you doing with it? You're going to put it back on c8? No. Okay, my friends, where does it go? That's right, e6. Just cover those beautiful open light squares. Get out of the way. Here comes f4. This is a pawn duo. Two pawns side by side next to each other like this. And these can be very, very dangerous. Castle. Get the king out of the way. Kind of it invites a little bit of an attack against the king because of this check. You have these weak light squares, but Ivanchuck is so cool in this position, he simply jumps to b8. Now, at first, that seems a little dangerous because you're walking into a corner and your opponent has a bishop cutting away your escape squares. But if you come to the middle, like if you come to d7, I'll turn the highlights on. You see the two white rooks? You're giving them a chance to play. For example, if f5 is played, you have to be very careful because if you take with the g-pawn, there's that move again. And if e5 gets played someday, you'll see that, what are you doing with this? You can't take because you're pinned. You see how this rook is coming to life? Your knight is attacked. What happens if your knight moves? Well, then you're going to get forked. So if you come into d7, you have to be very, very careful, okay? Moving your king to d7. So he's like, no big deal. I'll just go to b8. And now rook to d4. The alarm bells should be going off in your head. Rook d4. You see where that rook could be going? And do you see how the rook wants to communicate with the bishop? The pieces should talk to each other. Hey, man, what are you doing right now? Are you participating? Are you helping the team? Are you covering squares? So if the king asks the rook, why did you lift to d4? The rook's going to say, because I think I have an attack against the king. So how to handle that? You can't just play a random move. If you play a random move like h6, I'm doing this on purpose, you're going to get hit with this check. Your king has to go to a8, check, and now you're going to get hit with discovered checks. White could even make a draw, right? They could just keep repeating this position, but I don't think so. They'll just take a pawn check. You move your king somewhere, and then, the rook takes, and you're going to be in a whole lot of trouble. So no random moves. Rook d4. What do? He played knight d7. Simple chess. Back it up for a minute. What's the knight doing on this square? It's well posted. It's attacking the center, but that pawn is guarded by two pieces already, and you have a problem. So if you have a problem, use your pieces. Black is not attacking yet, so he needs to defend. He drops the knight back. He gets checked, and he uses the knight to block the check. Okay? So again, you guys are all coaches when you play. Talk to your pieces from the bench. Hey, knight, what are you doing? I'm blocking the rook out. Well, what if you're pinned. What if they come after you with the A pawn? No problem. Who's pinning me? The rook on b4. Okay. Attack it. Use your pawns. You have pawns like that. If the rook really wants to keep the pin, attack it again. And look at that rook. There's nowhere to go. I mean, unless you want to put the rook here on a5. I don't think so. This doesn't look good. So rooks don't belong in boxes, but it's good in this position that you see in case your partner tried to take advantage of your pin, you have an answer to it. So white just says, e5, trying to open the center. And Ivanchuck plays c5, hitting the rook. The same idea that I just showed you. And this is kind of cool because he's got all these pawns on dark squares on this side of the board. And look at his bishop. Can you guys see that? Look at the dark squares, all your pawns. And now look at your bishop. That bishop is sitting pretty. That's a really, really strong piece. Okay? Rook has to move. Goes to e4. Use your pawns and pieces. d5. Another pawn duo. Really strong. Sometimes these two pawns side by side could be worth a knight or a bishop. And now the rook drops back into the real world. Very important moment in the game. All of us have trouble sometimes missing things like this. Why are those highlights on, the h2 and the f4 pawn? Why? Because they're targets. If you don't have something clear to do, you're not sure what's going on, you've stopped your opponent's attack, maybe it's your turn to start doing something active. Go after weak pawns. So, you see him? Rook to f8, attacking the weak pawn. Which rook? Which rook? You see how the pawn is being attacked? I think Ivanchuck's thinking is, the rook on d8, talk to it. It's already moved when you castled. It's supporting a center pawn. That pawn might want to advance up the board someday. What is the rook on h8 doing right now? Not a whole lot. So if you're confused as to which rook, join the club. We all get confused. But in your mind, if you think that that rook that you just moved improves your position more, by all means do it. Some people who see positions like this, like moves like d4 to immediately attack the knight, and as good as that looks, you might just be pushing that knight to a nice central square, so maybe you don't want to do that. Attack the pawn. White defends it. And black eventually attacks the pawn again, but watch what he does first. He plays pawn to c6. By doing this, he opens up the c7 square. For who? Perhaps his king, who might want to come toward the center if an endgame breaks out. The center is secure. That kind of makes this bishop here on a6. Like, what are you doing over here, man? There's nobody to help you. So it runs away. Now he doubles rooks. Rook f7, rook f2, opening this square so the other rook can join the defense, but that's a mistake. Ivanchuck doubles, and pause your video and tell me why is this rook a mistake. Yep. Bishop h3, just attacking one of the defenders. The rook moved away, and we get to win a pawn. You might say, hey, it's just a pawn. It's a pawn, and it isolates this e-pawn, and that's really the only thing you have to worry about as black. Just make sure that pawn cannot queen. So after the trade, these rooks come off the board. a4, maybe harassing the knight, but the knight really doesn't worry because it has escape squares. King c7, like I mentioned before, coming closer to the center. a5 kicking the knight. Knight to d7, attacking the pawn. The pawn is attacked. If it's pushed, the bishop will take it. So bishop d1 was played. Why? That's going to help the pawn run. You see how the white rook is supporting that pawn? What are you going to do about that? Don't let that pawn push. Bishop e6. Pawn to b3. Notice how all of these squares on the open file, it's the only completely open file, are covered by your bishop, your knight, and your pawn. You guys see those squares? Once you realize that this rook cannot get in and this pawn is completely blockaded, look at white's pieces. Ivanchuck, look at this beautiful pawn structure. They can't do anything. So once those pawns or those pieces are kind of shut out, he just attacks another weakness, rook h4. And it's kind of a double attack because after it's protected, can you see where the black rook goes next? Look for targets. Rook h5. Come on, man. You guys can play like this. Wasn't that hard? 15-minute video. Every move you should understand. White resigns. You're going to be down a second pawn against a player like Ivanchuck. Better off go and have some pizza. All right, Grandmasters. See you in class.